Hey fellow gliders, welcome back. I'm Robert Petito, and in this video we're going to show you all the different ways you can create checklists in Glide. The nuance of a checklist is fairly simple, right? You have a list of items, you have a checkbox next to it, you check the box, the item is done. However, in Glide there's actually quite a few ways to create checklists, so we're going to go through a few of those ways, the different use cases when you might use one over the other, and we'll start something pretty basic, go to more advanced, and hopefully you learn something new. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So I have here a boilerplate app that gets created when you first create a new Glide app. I did enhance it with a list of projects, and I related them to a list of tasks from this tasks table. So for our first use case, let's create a checklist that maybe tracks different stages of a project. So the first checklist I'm going to show you is actually not a list at all, but rather just individual check boxes that point to these individual Boolean columns in the projects table. So if we're trying to track a few different points along the way, a few different items for every single one of our records, this might be a good solution. It's fairly easy to set up. You just create a Boolean column for the thing that you want to check off, or a couple of them. And then on the front end of your app, just visit the detail screen or the edit screen for that record, and you're going to create a checkbox component for every single one of those Boolean columns. So I'm going to go ahead and add a new component. I'm going to search for checkbox, not checklist, we'll get there, but checkbox. And we're going to point the checkbox to the Boolean column. What's nice is that the checkbox will try to find any Boolean columns that are already in your data table, so it'll make that adding pretty easily. Here's another little trick that if you open up your components pane and you drag in a component rather than just clicking on it, you can pick out where you want it. But also then the pane stays open. And you see that as you drag something in, it's going to try to find the next column. So here is the first column, here is the second column. I drag in another one. There's the third column, and there's the fourth column. So it's a quick way to be able to add items and have them be automatically assigned to different items in your table. So the checkbox component allows you to create a label. You can also write a description for each of these things, or you can set these things dynamically based upon some other type of column in your data table. You can also preview this checklist as boxes or as switches. Right? I typically prefer checkboxes when I'm creating a checklist for something, but switches make nice for like setting preferences or toggling things on or off. Now there's two big drawbacks to using this setup. The first being is that it's not dynamic, meaning you can only add checkboxes for the columns that you want to track. You can't allow your users to add in a new checkbox here because users can't control what components are being displayed nor create new columns. So you, the builder, have to create the columns, and you, the builder, have to create the checkboxes. So it's not dynamic on the user side. The other drawback is that you have to create a checkbox for every single column that you want to check off. So this works really well when you only have like 3 or 4 or 5 things you need to check. But what if you have a list of 50 things that you need to check off for everybody? That means you have to create 50 columns and 50 checkboxes, possibly 50 additional relation columns or 50 different if-then-else columns to check statuses for things. It gets really complicated. There's lots of points of failure there. So I only use this setup when I know that I'm going to deal with 2 or 3 or 4 things that I need to check off, because then it's manageable. And if it's not dynamic, if I know that it's going to be the same things that they're checking off for every single record in that table. All right, so if we wanted something more dynamic, we want to create a list of 100 things, maybe even allow users to add those things. You can't use a checkbox component. You're going to have to use some sort of list. Now, the first thing that comes to mind, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of these checkboxes here. The first thing that comes to mind is, instead of using a checkbox, is to use a checklist. Now, a checklist is a type of collection, and a collection in Glide always refers to rows of records. So that means that if I want those same things that I'm checking off, I have to, instead of using columns, have to put them down into rows. Okay, well, that's fairly easy to do, right? I can create a new table here of the tasks that I want to complete for the project, that everybody should complete for this project, let's say. And your thought maybe goes, okay, well, I'll just create another Boolean column. They can check things off. I can create a checklist. I'll point it to those project steps. I have my title as my task. They're checking things off as whether it's been complete or not. That should all work. However, unfortunately, this doesn't work in our use case because as I check things off, I'm checking off those values in the table. And these values are not project specific. They're not user specific. They're just generic 4 items living in some table somewhere. And which means that every single time I go to visit any project, I'm going to see those same things checked off. So for a checklist where we want a standardized set of things to check off, we can't use a checklist unless the checklist is pointing to a project-specific row, which means I'll need to specify the project somewhere in this data table as well. I can create a project ID column. I'll copy these project IDs and paste those in. All right, so these 4 tasks will pertain to this project, so I need to copy the project ID here. And I want those same 4 tasks to apply to my other projects as well. Okay, that means I have to copy these tasks and paste them again, and then copy this project ID down. Okay, so this would work, right? Because now these tasks are project specific. So now in my projects table, I could relate the row ID to this project ID, or on the front end here, I can just filter this collection to display only the tasks where the project ID matches the ID of the screen I'm on, right? So is the screen's row ID, which is the project ID. Okay, so now we have some project-specific tasks, right? We have these 4 tasks, only the first 2 completed. And if I go to my other, I can mark just this one. So we see we now have project-specific tasks. So some pros and cons to this. The biggest benefit is that it's dynamic, right? I can create however many rows I need and display them and filter them. We get to use the checklist component, which is very pretty, right? It's got nice large checkbox toggles that I can tap on. We can display a title and a description. We can allow users to add more items if we so wanted to. We could also then, because it's a collection, allow our users to dive into any of these tasks to see more information about it, right? We don't get this with the checkbox component. We only get this with the collection component, right? So that's really nice. Now, the biggest drawback to using this is that, as you might have noticed, it's not very lean, right? That means every time we create a new project, we have to create that same list of tasks. And if it's a set of 50 different tasks, well, that means we have to create 50 rows for every project. You can see how it would quickly eat into your row quota that you have for any of your glide plans. So the only time I really use this setup is when users are adding their own tasks and cleaning up after themselves. And I'll show you that more in just a minute. Okay, so let's kind of wrap this up. What might be another alternative besides Checkbox and besides Checklist that will allow us the benefit of both worlds, where we're keeping our data table nice and lean, where we're going to store the records of what's being tracked on the project itself maybe, but still allow for a dynamic list of items, so that way we don't need to add 50 components to our screen. So there is an alternative, and the alternative is actually not to use a checklist whatsoever, but rather to use a choice component. So let me show you what that setup looks like. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this collection, and we're going to go back to our projects table, and we're going to create a column in here that's going to keep track of all of the things that we've checked. So I'm going to call this completed tasks. And it's just going to be a text column. And what we're going to do is, instead of storing the different things that we're checking off in individual columns here, we're going to keep track of all of them in a singular cell. So if we check off these 3 things, we're going to have a list of 3 things that we've checked off. And we can create that using a choice component. So in our layout, I'm going to go ahead and create a new component here. I'm going to point to a choice component, drag that in. Okay, and then this choice component is going to write to that completed tasks field that we just created. But our source is going to be that table of standardized tasks. So my source is going to be the project steps task. And now that we're creating a standardized list, we no longer need project-specific tasks anymore. So I can trash those duplicates. I can actually trash this checkbox. And I can trash the project ID. We don't need any of this anymore. All we need is just the task and a row ID. And the reason why we need a row ID is because the task that we're trying to have them complete might be sentences long. It might involve punctuation. It might have commas in it, and commas will throw off a choice component every single time. So it's best to have something unique like a row ID here. So I'm going to go ahead and configure this choice component now. So we're going to write to that completed tasks, and our source table is going to be our project steps. Our values are going to be our row ID, but we're going to display the actual task itself. All right, so now we see that our tasks are here. This doesn't look much like a checklist yet. It still looks like a drop-down menu, but we can configure this choice component to look like a checklist. So under the style, we're going to convert it from a drop-down to radio buttons. All right, it's looking a little better. Okay, next we want to get rid of that dash on the top. So we're going to mark it as required to get rid of that dash. And the last thing is that we want them to be able to select multiple things to check off the items. So we're going to allow selecting multiple. And now our choice component looks like a checklist. Okay, so just so you see how this is working, as they're checking items off this list, it's writing the row ID of that task to this completed tasks field. And it comma separates them like this. Okay, and because this is living on its own project record row, right, and we can visit a different project and we get a new list. So this is kind of the best of both worlds, right? We have a dynamic listed table. We can add to it as much as we want because it's just more rows, but we're keeping track of that list of items in a singular cell on the listed project itself. The drawback here is that when you're using the choice component as a checklist, you're very limited in terms of design, right? With both the checkbox and the checklist, we were able to display a title and a description. With the checklist, we were even able to go a step further and dive into the record to see more information. With a choice component, you don't get that, right? With a choice component, the only thing that you get is to click on it or not click on it. You get one thing of text, and that body of text is whatever you're having to display in the display as field here. So surely if you want to display something else, you could maybe concatenate some values using a template column and throw them in there, but you see that whatever you're displaying here has to be just kind of simple text. So this works really nicely for simple use cases when you want to keep your app nice and lean. Now, another great use case for this setup is if you want to create a recurring checklist. So let's say you wanted to have your users open the app, complete some things, the next day they open the app again, and the list has been cleared, waiting for them to complete the list anew. So you can do that using the choice component. And here's the trick that makes this happen. So anytime a user completes a task, it writes the row ID to this completed tasks field. And the choice component sees that the value is here and checks it accordingly. So that means that if at any point in time this value changes and doesn't match the source row ID anymore, then it won't be checked anymore because it doesn't find that match. So just so you see, if I delete this A from the row ID, you see that it unchecks. And if I add it back again, and it checks it off again. So we can take advantage of this in order to create a recurring checklist. So let's say we wanted to, again, have them complete these values every day. That means we need some sort of day value that we're going to append to this row ID. So we're going to use a math column for that. I'm going to call it today, search for math, and for configuration, I can just type anything. I'll type now. And I'm going to replace now with the now variable. This only exists in the math column like this. Now we only want today. We don't want time or anything like that because we don't want our checklist changing every second. So we're going to get rid of the time and get the date only. This date only is a medium format, which means it has a comma in it. And again, we got to remove commas altogether. So we're going to change our date format to short. That way it keeps everything as one block of text with no space. So I hit save. This one looks good. And now I'm going to combine it with our row ID using a template column. So I'm going to call this today value. And type's going to be a template column. I'm going to combine the two things with two variables, 1 and 2. I'll add replacements for each, where 1 is the row ID and 2 is the today value, like that. So now we see that for each of our tasks, we have the date appended to the end here. Okay, so then back in our choice component, I'm going to use that value as the values field. Okay, so now I can check things off, right? And then the next day, what's going to happen is that this completed task section with all of these 19s in it, because today is the 19th, this is what I'm recording here. So all of these 19s are no longer going to match the current day, the 20th. And it'll uncheck these boxes. So just so you see how that might work, I'm going to go ahead and pretend it's tomorrow by adding a day to our now value. And now that it's the 20th, we see our today value has 20s in it. It's no longer going to match those 19s and thus uncheck the boxes. So this is a way that you can create a recurring checklist for your users. And all you have to do is just adjust when you want it to reoccur. If you want it recurring every week, then what you have to do is you have to use the week value. So to do that, we can do the year of now. This is the formula that I typically use. So we have our year times 100 plus the week num, that is, of our date, where date is now. Okay, so that means every week it's going to change from 08, then next week it's 09, the following week is 10, and so forth. It just uses the week number. Or if you want to have a monthly recurring something, instead of week num, you use month. Right? Since it's February, it's 02, and so forth. Okay, if you want just a yearly recurring, then just get the year. You get the idea. So this is a nice little trick that I've employed in several apps in order to create a recurring checklist. So again, pros, it's very lean. It does allow you to have this recurring checklist functionality, but again, cons is that it's fairly simple. You can only display one line of text for that checklist. All right, let's go ahead and switch gears. I'm going to get rid of our completed tasks component here. And all of our projects have a list of tasks that users can create for themselves. So I do have a related tasks table here where I'm capturing the project ID, right? And I also have, yes, a completed button in here. So if they wanted to create a checklist, they certainly could point it to that relation of tasks. And here we can configure it where the checked field is going to point to that completed field. Our title can be the title, right? Description and so forth. And because it's a collection here, we can allow users to add more items to their checklist. Right? All that's possible. Okay, and this works really nicely when the only thing you want to track is, did they complete it or did they not complete it? All of the solutions we've seen so far, the checkbox, the checklist, the choice component, involve just checking off something or unchecking something. True, false, checked, not checked. But often you want to track more than just true or false. You want to track a timestamp, or maybe you want when they check something off to trigger an action that notifies somebody or emails someone or sends a text message saying that they've checked it off, right? All of those things. In order to do that, you can't use a checklist. At the time of me making this video, Glide does not have a way for you to trigger an action when you check a box. One day, hopefully that comes. But until then, you have to push a button somewhere, and then that button can trigger an action. Okay. So for that reason, when I need that functionality, I don't use a checklist because otherwise it's confusing to have a checkbox and a button somewhere, let's say. So in that case, what I do is instead of using a checklist, I end up using just a list instead. You can do a list, get rid of the image here, I don't need it, and I can display it as cards, okay? Or you can do a table. And if you do table, it kind of alternates colors, which is kind of nice. Okay, but this doesn't look much like a checklist yet, and there's no button to mark things complete yet either. So you need some sort of button here. To add a button on any table, okay, we need an action, and this action, we need to enable advanced actions, and then we can add a collection item action. Okay, so now we get this button. On a mobile view, it's not great because it's hidden behind these triple dots. On desktop view, the button will be there, which is nice. Now, if you need a visible button right here on your mobile view, then instead of a normal collection here, you can use a custom collection. Okay, that custom collection can still point to that relation of tasks. Then you just fill it with either a title component or an action text component. So if I do an action row component, my action row can be my task, like this. And now I actually get a visible button here as well. So then I can say like mark complete. This can be like a check icon, and then I have my action like this. So you can use a custom collection to do checklists as well. Okay, let's go back to our regular collection. I'm going to hide it behind a triple dots. It's fine. Okay, so my action here, I'm going to give it a title of mark complete. I'm going to give it a check icon. So now we have to determine what the action is. Now, if when I mark something complete, I want it to send a notification and record the timestamp, that means I need a column where I'm recording a timestamp. Okay, that true false, that completed or not complete column is not going to cut it anymore. So I'm going to create a new column. I'm going to call this completed at. Type's going to be a basic date time column, and this is going to serve as a timestamp. Okay. Something else that I do is maybe set like a status. So I can add an if then else and call this status. Type is going to be an if then else. And I'm going to say if completed at is empty, then it's still like incomplete. Else it's complete. You can use icons and emojis, right? So if I wanted to, I could add a check in here like this. You get the idea. Okay, so now that I have my list and I have a button, I just have to configure this button to mark the thing complete. So under actions, under collection item actions, I'm going to change my show notification, and I'm going to create a brand new action here. And we're going to call this action mark complete. Okay. Yes, we want to show notification, but we also want to set the column values of our completed at to be the current date and time, like that. So when they push the button, it then records the timestamp. Then if we want to also do anything else, like notify somebody, we can do that. We can do a send email, right? Or we could do Twilio and send an SMS message, or WhatsApp, or you get the idea. You can do multiple things here as part of that button press of marking something complete. Okay, so now I can mark something complete, right? And what this does is that in my tasks table, I now have some dates and my completed at. So now we just have to mark that visually somehow in our layout. So a couple ways you can do that. First is you can actually change the meta to be the status, so you can see if something is complete or incomplete. That's one way to do it. You could add the image of being complete or incomplete, like this. Okay, you could also set, or you could group. So under options, I can group by the status of being complete or incomplete, and I can sort by let's say the completed at, so all my completed things are at the bottom. So this is a setup that I do often in the apps that I build, where we have users who want to be able to add their own items and keep track of the statuses of those items, to still mark things complete, but then also to track timestamps and incur additional actions as well. The downside with this setup is that it doesn't really look like a checklist. And if you're on a mobile view, again, that button's kind of hidden behind the actual item itself. So it's definitely a trade-off, but it's definitely the most flexible and the most dynamic and provides the most functionality when it comes to completing an item as part of a to-do list of items. So hopefully you found a couple of new ways to create checklists in Glide, some of those checklists not even being lists or checks at all. So hopefully you're able to now implement one of these for your use case in your app. I would love to learn more about how you're using checklists in your app. Feel free to leave me a comment below. You can also reach out to me at Twitter at @rpetito. And as always, thanks for watching.